Thank you very much. I'm really grateful for everyone who's joined us tonight to talk a little bit and share somewhat about the resolutions that have been submitted through Ethnic Ministries Circles of Color. And each of the sponsors who have done that on our behalf are members of the circle, and then also people committed to the goals that we're working toward as a whole diocese. So I'm so grateful for all of you this evening. And I'm going to invite Katya to go ahead and please put up our slideshow. And please know that after each of the sections, we're going to give about 5 minutes for you to submit any questions into the chat. And our chaplain, Terry Kylo, will be looking at those questions and making sure they are answered. And then we'll just move through all of them. So we'll make sure we go through all 6. And at the end, we'll hopefully have some time preserved to answer any questions that may remain. So thank you, please. The next slide. So what we're asking, and so the norms we've heard about just keeping ourselves muted unless you're talking. And if you need to turn off your camera, certainly feel free to do that. And when you speak, just introduce yourself. And each of us will be doing that as well as we begin. And if you type, I would like to ask a question in the chat, and make sure that you maybe give an understanding of what that question might be. And we'll remain on time as we can all the way through and contract with you to be concluding at 7 o'clock today. And if you have any technical problems, we have Carrie, who is there as the tech guy in the name of his square. So you can certainly get a hold of him through the chat and a private chat. Next slide. These are our presenters this evening, who are the sponsors of the resolutions that we'll be sharing. I'm Rachel Tabor Hamilton, the rector at Trinity Episcopal Church in Everett, Washington, and I am the coordinator for Circles of Color. And then we also have with us the Reverend Deacon Polly Shigaki, the Reverend Nigel Tabor Hamilton, the Reverend Josefina Beecher, the Reverend Dr. Edie Weller, and the Reverend Carla Robinson, all of our sponsors for resolutions. Next. So first, I want to make sure that we take a moment to look at the preamble that we created to go with as the introduction to these resolutions. And if you haven't had an opportunity to go look at that, we'll provide that for you in the chat with a link about where you can find our resolutions with this preamble. Next. In the preamble, we go through some key events in the history of the diocese that sort of lead up to the need for these resolutions. And part of that is that from about 2006 to 2007, we had just a whole lot of change in the diocese through to 2011. And during that time period, Ethnic Ministries committees that we had, like our African American committee, our Indigenous committee, and so forth, began to become disenfranchised as the 3 key positions of the diocese staff were let go, who used to be able to hold this work and keep us together and connected as community and supported. And that was the position of the suffragan bishop, Nettie Rivera, the ethnic missioner that was full-time, Jerry Shigaki, and also the assistant, who at that time was Carla Robinson, and also Elsie Dennis. So as those positions went away and the focus became on ethnic ministries, was replaced by multicultural competency. And that competency training really focused more on preparing white folks for being able to have challenging conversations. And it wasn't really so much focused on the support of our communities and people of color in the diocese. And then there was the restructuring of diocesan council in resolutions in 2011, that because we weren't drawing from those commissions as representatives to council any longer, we lost a lot of minority representation. Next. And the consequences of all of this was, over the past decade, we've really experienced an isolation of the people of color in the diocese from a real centralized and integrated set of networks of communities, and each of us becoming increasingly isolated from one another and from the decision-making stream of the diocese, especially those decisions which affect us and our communities. So we've also experienced sort of an arrested development of the leadership formation that had been driven by Nettie Rivera and others for the formation of people of color. And the acronym that you're going to see again and again, BIPOC, stands for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color. That people of color includes all of our communities. And we also had funding taken away from us that supported those positions and many of the ministries that had been active ministries. So we lost representation at many levels of the organization and in the decision-making stream. Next. The goals that we have now are really the ones that we have talked about and named and claimed as really wanting to grow the people of color communities in the church and better support people of color in a holistic leadership development model, one that integrates deeper understanding of the needs of our people of color and the appreciation of the diversities of cultures that we represent. We are really having a goal toward representation of our people of color in all levels of the governance and decision-making in the diocese in order to create genuine partnerships and not ones that are sort of represent, tokenary and portray faces, but not really having space for voices and empowerment. So we are very deeply committed to the advocacy and support of our people of color and to addressing issues of systemic racism. Next. So as we have been dreaming and planning of really walking toward becoming the beloved community, where all of us truly feel a sense of equity and mutual appreciation, we began to reach out to one another. Next. To give you a sense of the origins of how Circles of Color even came to be. And Circles of Color was really the result of a desert experience, sort of a diaspora of all our people of color who had been very much aware and interconnected in the diocese and a part of the decision-making and representation. And when we lost our staffing, we lost our funding, and we lost one another. So one of the things that we have as a goal is we began to reach out to one another just last fall again, and to offer one another mutual support. We became recommitted to wanting to support people in leadership development. So all of these goals that we have, we're not trying to recreate the past. We are really wanting to move into new and innovative ways to do this work together. Next. And so the model, if you think of it, Circles of Color is really one big circle, but it's interlinked with these sub-communities. And so right now, our Circles of Color have grown from the original leadership circle that began to conceptualize what these virtual networks would be like, to include Clergy Circle of Color, African American, Black American Circle of Color, an Indigenous Circle, Asian Circle, Hispanic, Latino, and postulants of color in our diocese. Next. Each of those circles are led by a clergy of color or an ally. And also, we continue to look at circles that will continue to develop. People can belong to more than one circle if they're multiracial, if they might maybe identify as LGBTQ, if they identify as youth and as Asian. So they can belong to as many circles as support. So these are the circles that we're hoping, to continue to develop. We have an ally circle, and that continues in its development. And also we are kind of imagining developing a youth circle and working with folks like Alex Flanagan and what that might look like. Next. So I'd like to take a moment to see, for those of you who perhaps had the chance to look at the history or reflect on anything that I've just shared with you very quickly, I wonder if you have any questions about what we've shared with you so far. Thank you. I'd like to continue. Next slide. So we have basically submitted 6 resolutions from Ethnic Ministries Circles of Color. And if you have questions as we go along, I totally encourage you to put your questions as they arise in the chat. And when we come to a moment of being able to look at those, we will address those and have Terry Kylo form those for us and present them for us. So the 6 resolutions then are really informed by the history and the consequences and the goals that I've just gone through with us. So here are a little bit of an overview of the 6 resolutions. Each of these have a number that's been assigned by convention. The first 3 resolutions of convention have to do with the business of convention, like the budget and the cost of living increase for clergy and assessment. So those things are business pieces. So we became resolution number 4, promoting diversity on diocesan council. Resolution 5, which is a resolution to make the term diversity explicit and unpack that a bit within Canon 17, a diocesan canon that addresses diversity in appointments of positions. And Resolution 6 is toward a more representative partnership in the change to Diocesan Canon 22 regarding the Commission on Ministry. Next. Resolution 7 is the desire to establish a ministry fund for Black, Indigenous, and people of color who are specifically leading congregations of color and who may at this point be non-stipendiary, and they've fallen through the cracks in terms of the models of leadership in the church. Then Resolution 8 is a resolution to add a cultural interpreter as an optional bring-in to help facilitate conversation and cultural representation in both directions, from dominant culture to minority culture, of anyone who's in an ordination process. And finally, resolution number 9 is an anti-racism covenant that was created in Diocese of Missouri, and it leaves a final point in there that makes it open-ended so that any diocese or any congregation can kind of add on additional commitments to what their anti-racism covenant might be. So we're asking for convention to adopt this covenant as a tool for study and reflection within our leadership groups and congregations. Thank you. So the first resolution, Resolution 4, is the one that I've sponsored, and promoting diversity on diocesan council. Next. So be it resolved that the 110th Convention of the Diocese of Olympia adopt the following changes to Canon 6 of Diocesan Constitutions and Canons concerning diocesan council. Next. And basically what we're talking about, and I'm not necessarily going to go through word for word of what this resolution is. And again, I'm hoping that you've had an opportunity to look at it, and you can just kind of slowly go through it like you are. And you can find these resolutions in 2 places. You can find them in the Resolutions Committee report, and you can find them also on a blog site that we can provide to you in the chat that you can go look at that includes that preamble. And Katya, if you want to kind of keep going through this a little bit. And and then what you're seeing here, I'm so sorry, thank you. Yeah, what you're seeing in this slide is how we propose to kind of transition from a regional representation into one that over a gradual process of 3 years. The terms don't change, it's 3-year terms, but why we're asking for this? This resolution essentially asks for a bit of a return to what we were as council before the changes that were created by a resolution in 2011. Before what had happened, because we'd had very active ethnic ministries and we'd had an ethnic ministries commission, there were 6 seats that were preserved for people representing those committees and commissions that had a seat on diocesan council. And so when so much else became deconstructed about ethnic ministries, this piece in 2011 sort of put the exclamation point on the deconstruction of the representation of our minority voices in the halls of decision making. Because when it became completely a regional representation, a couple of things happened. First of all, most of our representation in those rural regions tend to be heavily white because our predominantly people of color populations are in the urban centers. And I know that there's always sort of been this tension between the rural areas and Seattle areas. But what's kind of wonderful about the networks that are developing now is they aren't constrained to just a region or just an urban center or lost to us out into the regional areas in the countryside. So we're able now to have a sense of representation from throughout the diocese, but also preserving at least 6 seats for that diversity to be represented. And we will still have regional representation, but it will go to having 1 representative from each region, and then 4 representatives at large that can come from anywhere and be elected. And so those 4 we were asking for 2 to be lay and 2 to be clergy. And then with regard to the regional representation, we're asking for that to flip back and forth each term, 3 years term, from clergy to lay. And so kind of keeping a track of when it's the next time to elect someone from one order or the other. But in the meantime, preserving some 6 seats that can be appointed by the bishop. Next. And just kind of going through, these are just the technical things of how to make everything happen. So you can kind of slowly keep going through these, Katya, for me. I appreciate that. And so taking a look at that, there is nothing substantive that has changed about the structure other than the way that it's being represented, and that now we have seats that can also be appointed, so that there's intentionality and a commitment from the diocese to assure that we have representation of our people of color on council always. So this is, again, this explanation. I've tried to kind of go through those, what I've been talking about here. This model is not new. It's what we used to do up until 2011. And this is sort of a little bit of a restoration, but also, again, stretching us into thinking about this in new ways as well. The total number on council will remain the same. And it's always been that sort of set of, what am I get 20? I think it is. I had to go back and look. And so we preserve the 10. So we have 10 regions, and then we have 6 representatives from POC, or people of color around the diocese, and then 4 at large. So it remains the same. There are currently 20 people on council, and that would remain the same. And the bishop, of course, is the president of council. Next. So I would like to invite any questions, and I welcome you to put those in the chat. It looks like we're getting some supportive comments. Terry, is there anything that we should be looking at?
Mary Lyons has asked, it's a longer statement here, and she's pointing out that thinking about being diverse isn't the same thing as being diverse. And then she asks, what challenges do you see in presenting these resolutions this year and doing so remotely?
Well, I think what happens in this kind of format is that we really are relying on people to do their homework, to really look carefully at resolutions and not wait until the last minute, and also to take advantage of asking any of us questions. Our emails have been published along with the report, and they've been on the blog site where these have been published since the beginning of September. So I think we've had several emails go out and things like that from the bishop's office. So we're just really hoping that people understand it, have taken time to reflect on it, and taken time to ask questions. So without sort of, what I want to do is have Terry just keep an eye on those questions and move on to our next resolution presentation.
Hello, I'm Polly Shigaki of the Deacon at St. Peter's in Seattle, and I will be presenting a substitute resolution number 5, which essentially is to make diversity, the definition of diversity explicit from Canon 17 as regarding the diversity in appointments. And the language that we had used to add was in appointing members to diocesan commissions, committees, boards, and other bodies. And in the issues of clergy deployment, the appointing authority shall give due consideration to the value of diversity in such areas as gender, sexual identity and orientation, physical ability. The word neurodiversity was added, age, race, ethnicity, income, and wealth status. And our rationale for asking for this is the new wording will serve as a reminder of what exactly is meant by the term diversity, which is very broad and can be used in many different ways, and particularly in the issues of clergy deployment. We're encouraging parishes and the bishop's office to proactively encourage diversity when considering new clergy calls. In terms of the questions that were received from the resolutions committee about why we needed this, and maybe the terminology can change, that is true, but it's kind of a point to highlight the lived experience of BIPOC folks in our diocese, and that our gifts and presence and unique perspective are often largely unrecognized, where we often remain invisible, marginalized, and unacknowledged. And also, a way of naming these diversities is addressing the unconscious biases in deliberately considering and appointing BIPOC people to seats in leadership, and fully appreciating all the gifts that are offered by our community. So are there any questions about the general information of the intent of that? And otherwise, we can move to the next one.
I'd like to also add, thank you, Polly, that Polly mentioned that her resolution is going to be a substitute resolution. What you've just walked through is a version of it that has been based out of the ongoing dialogue with the resolutions committee. So the resolutions committee has kind of asked for some clarity on some things. You know, there have been 3 of our resolutions that have adapted based on some of that input and feedback. So because of how time crunched all these processes have been in this reality, the resolutions committee report has both the old resolution form of resolution 5, 6, and 8 within the body of its report, and then put the revised forms of resolution 5, 6, and 8 in the appendices. So if you want to see the one we're talking about for Polly's, you'll go down to the appendices of the Committee of Resolutions report to find this version. So I invite you to look at that, but that's the ones that we're talking from today. And just be aware that you'll need to go make sure that when you're reading resolution, if it's resolution 5 or 6 or 8, go to the one that's in the appendices. Any further questions for Polly?
So one of the questions is, how would we monitor the implications of the resolution? There's support for it from Karen, but just concerned about how that would be monitored.
I think that we're hoping the authority lies obviously with the bishop's office and the canon to the ordinary, but we hope there would be a real intention of perusing all kinds of documents in the history of folks when they come up for selection or election to any of these bodies. And we would hope that the circles of color will be proactive in trying to make sure that that's happening, and to promote all the folks that we can.
And I think any kind of concern from the resolutions committee had to do with, well, there's so many ways to think about diversity. Can't we just keep it this one itty bitty word? And so as they, kind of gave us some input, we did include like neurodiversity, because that specifically came up for them in their conversations, and we're glad to add that. And I think our collective feeling is how important it is to make it explicit, so that people actually have to talk about it and think about it and not assume they know what it is. What is diversity? And it may be that in the future, other people will want to add more to it. So why not do that, so that we're all continuing to be aware of the nature of diversity? Holly, do you have anything else?
No, I don't. Thank you very much.
I really appreciate the conversation, and I'd like to move to the next resolution.
Hello, everyone. My name's Nigel Tabor Hamilton. I've been around for a while. Many of you know that I was the rector at St. Augustine's in the Woods in Freeland until last year when I retired. I was asked to sponsor this resolution and I'm reading this incidentally because I don't want to go on too long. I was asked to sponsor this resolution as a Circles of Color ally on behalf of the Circles of Color because I've served as multiple terms as a chair of a commission on ministry in another diocese, the Diocese of Indianapolis, and also on Province 5 Commission on Ministry, which is basically the upper Midwest. I also worked with the late Bishop Jim Kelsey and those who helped to bring about the changes to the Title III canons, our national canons on ministry back in 2006 at the General Convention in Columbus, Ohio. So I want to begin by thanking the Resolutions Committee and also Constitution and Canons for their very helpful feedback and their recommendations for this resolution. I think it's obvious to everyone, but I'm going to say it, that COVID-19 has forced on us a process that really didn't allow enough time for the back and forth that was really needed to perfect these resolutions. We, Circles of Color as a whole, responded to the initial responses of the Constitution, Canons and Resolutions Committee by rewriting our explanation and also making changes to the proposals to try and address some of the concerns they raised, and I think we did. The decision of resolutions, because of the time constraints, was to submit in their report, in the body of the report, the first edition that we submitted, and then to include the revised edition in the appendix, as Rachel said. So what we're talking about right now is the revised edition in the appendix, which is, I think, on page 19. What will happen with all of these ones that have been changed, as I understand it, is that on the floor, the sponsor will then submit a friendly substitute. And since we wrote it, we're going to accept it. And then the conversation will be about that. So if you want to read the process we went through here, then you can read the first edition on page 9 and then go to the revised edition on page 19. Now, first of all, and this is true of all of these are not written in stone. We're presenting these 2 or 3 years from now. Let's say if it doesn't work or if more things need to be changed, they can be changed. So this is not a forever thing. And that's very true, for example, with the issues of diversity. As we become more aware of those things that we would want to include, the canon can be changed again. So it's not a question of saying we have to reject this because it doesn't go far enough. It's the start. Now, several points very quickly. First of all, it's really important to see all of these resolutions, not just in the context of an individual resolution, but in a broader context as a package. They all interact with each other. And so you can find out, for example, by looking at some of the changes in the Diocesan Council proposal, how there's a balance being sought moving across, for example, the Commission on Ministry. So let me give you an example. Well, let me say, first of all, one of the things we're doing, as I just mentioned, is in this resolution in particular, is to reflect the changes that were made in 2006 to the national Title III canons. When I was the chair of Commission on Ministry in Indianapolis in the 90s, the Title III Canon 1 was on the Commission on Ministry, and it began in every diocese there will be a Commission on Ministry, period. The commission is responsible for all ministry in the diocese. But what happened, and I think it still happens, is that because the ordination process for ordained ministry, it takes up so much time, then the ministry of the baptized, which is all of us, doesn't get appropriate attention. So the canons were changed, and you should go and look at what the national canons now say, because they use that language, all baptized people. So that's what we're trying to do here, say it's about all the baptized. So for example, you'll notice that if you read the canon as it exists now and know the process, that the bishop appoints the commission, and the commission is made up of 1/3 lay, 1/3 priests, and 1/3 deacons. So it's 2/3 ordained, 1/3 lay, all members of the baptized. Now, what we're proposing is let's make that 50-50 ordained lay. that's a balance. And it also, by doing that, addresses a reality in our diocese, which is often goes unnoticed, which is that the number of BIPOC clergy in our diocese has shrunk. It never really was reflective of the number of BIPOC folk in our diocese, but it's much worse now. There are very few BIPOC clergy. So by making the balance 50-50, we're expanding the possibility of having BIPOC folk being on the Commission on Ministry, because now we can draw more people onto the commission in the lay order. It'll increase the pool, in other words. Now, the package as a whole makes the process of creating the Commission on Ministry and Diocesan Council reflective of the theme of partnership. And I want to come back to that, because you'll notice one of the comments in the first iteration the Resolutions Committee put forward was that we were taking away the bishop's authority. What we're actually trying to do is balance. So if you look at Diocesan Council, we're actually asking the bishop to appoint people, whereas now it's fully elected. And here what we're saying is, let's make it a partnership. Let's make it half appointed by the bishop and half appointed, elected by convention. Let's rely on the wisdom of all the baptized. Just as an example of other dioceses, and I was also in California, California had a similar model to this. And Indianapolis had 1/3 appointed by the bishop, 1/3 elected by convention, and 1/3 appointed by standing committee. There was no council, so that's how that worked. So the focus of overall here is what we're trying to say is, let's focus on all of the baptized. Let's honor the canon, which says that the responsibility of the commission is about the ministry of all of the baptized, not simply those who are ordained. And the rest fall through the cracks. Let's balance that out and rely on the wisdom of everyone to do that. So that's the overall view of the changes here. When we submit the on the floor the changes, I personally found the substitute at the end a little confusing, and so we'll try and clean that up in terms of it being, this is read and what changed from the previous version and so on. But the overall idea is balance, 50-50. Let's involve everyone in this whole process. Does anyone have any questions about that?
I'm not seeing any that haven't been kind of responded to in the chat yet right now, Nigel.
Okay, thanks. Well, there we go. So I will pass this back now to Rachel, and we can move on to the next one.
Thank you. And again, as we go through things this evening, if questions do come to you, just put them in the chat, and we'll revisit these at the end also. And we're also available to you at any time to answer questions. Thank you. And the next resolution, please.
My name is Josefina Beecher. I'm a retired clergy person, previously doing Hispanic ministry in the Diocese of Olympia, specifically in Mount Vernon, Washington, and Skagit County, in La Iglesia de la Resurrección. I'm here to talk to you about resolution number 7, which you can find on page 12 of the convention document D2, and it's titled Establishing a BIPOC Ministry Fund. You can read the explanation, which I have submitted with this resolution. The gist of it is, at present, our diocese is using the Iona School program for training for those who will exercise an ordained ministry in small, financially challenged worshiping communities. These clergy are expected to work without a salary, church-provided health insurance, or church pension fund contributions. When this program is used for training BIPOC priests, it reveals the inequity of the way our diocese is treating BIPOC communities. This fund will be a concrete step to correct discrimination against BIPOC persons and communities. You can also read the questions posited by the Resolutions Committee in the Resolutions Committee report in that same document D2. I hope I can explain the urgent need for this fund and answer some of your and the committee's questions. First, the Resolutions Committee asked for more detail about the need for the establishment of this fund. We have a few ethnic congregations in this diocese, specifically Sudanese, Cambodian, and Chinese, who have clergy that are not being paid. And still, they have all the responsibilities of paid clergy. And there are a few more Latino congregations where clergy coverage has been lacking or inadequate, and the diocese is resolving this need by training so-called local clergy at the Iona School. And there is at least one First Nations community asking for a priest to come to them. This resolution is not about the merits of seminary-trained versus non-seminary trained clergy. It is not about the rights of priests in this diocese to receive good compensation for their work. It is about the injustice of a huge discrepancy between how clergy are paid for low-income ethnic communities of color versus how clergy are paid in predominantly white congregations. This is not just a few unique situations or individuals. It is a systemic response which treats people of color as other, and quite frankly, violates our baptismal vows to respect the dignity of all human beings. This fund is to be established to begin to correct this inequity by creating a designated fund from which clergy serving BIPOC communities can be paid. Secondly, the Resolutions Committee suggests that the affected clergy sit down with council and the bishop and his staff to talk about their needs. The bishop and his staff are perfectly aware of those needs, but asking the clergy from high context communities of color to lay out their financial needs in front of the diocesan council would be to disrespect and shame those clergy and postulants. Let me explain what I mean by high context communities. A quick definition is that high context cultures are those that communicate in ways that are implicit and rely heavily on context. In contrast, low text cultures rely on explicit verbal communication. High context cultures are collectivist, value family and close interpersonal relationships, and have members that form stable, close relationships. Low context cultures value individualism and personal independence and value close nuclear family relationships rather than multi-generational family. To return to our postulants of color and clergy serving BIPOC communities, their acceptance of the current situation as a condition to providing their communities the ordained clergy they need. In other words, their acceptance of not being paid as a condition to being ordained is a function of their cultural context, and that needs to be understood and honored by those of the dominant culture, as opposed to hauling them in front of diocesan council to explain their family accounting. If this were not a virtual convention, I would have a bucket on a table in the hallway to start off this fund, because I'm not ashamed of begging. But the people that we're charging with growing our church among communities of color should not have to be constantly humbled and constantly have to be begging. These ministries and clergy shouldn't have to be supported by our leftovers. We desperately need a strategic plan for development of congregations of color. I've done this work, and I know that Latino communities love being part of the Episcopal Church. They love our liturgy, they love our inclusiveness, they love our commitment to social justice. And then they find out that we have no plan to provide them with a pastor to care for them, to teach them, to baptize their children. Thirdly, while not being paid at the established diocesan rate for clergy, the diocese has provided funding and no doubt will continue to try to do so. However, it is all at the discretion of the bishop. As a white clergy person, were I working at a white church, I would be paid according to a clearly established salary scale, including health insurance and pension contributions. While I might have to negotiate exactly where on that scale I would be paid, that would then be put in my letter of agreement, and I would get prescribed increases, again clearly laid out, subject of course to a mutual ministry review. If I were one of these few clergy of color serving in communities of color, I would have to get a full-time job outside of my full-time responsibilities as pastor, preacher, liturgist, crisis counselor, administrator, and maintenance staff of my church. And if ends did not meet, I would have to go to the bishop and beg for help. None of the people this fund would benefit expect to make between $65,000 and $140,000, as white and seminary trained clergy expect. None of them have asked for this fund to be set up. They all just want to serve God and serve their communities. And it is really hard to do that when you're working the night shift 6 or 7 days a week at McDonald's. As an aside here, I'd like to address a question that the Resolutions Committee did not explicitly ask. You may be in a rural congregation or an urban congregation with dwindling numbers, and you ask, why should this just be for BIPOC communities? Can our congregation access this fund? I sympathize with you, and I understand your concerns, but I ask you to prayerfully return to the purpose of these 6 resolutions brought by the Circles of Color. The purpose is to address and repair systemic and historical injustice. The church where I'm currently serving would love to have a full-time vicar, but it would never occur to them to say to a prospective priest, we can't pay you, but you can probably get a job slinging burgers in town. Your church probably has someone or more than one someone who can keep the books and maybe even write grants. There is probably an ample pool of possible clergy who speak the language or languages of your community. Your congregation hopefully has people of color in it, but chances are they have grown up here and have acquired knowledge of the dominant culture and can function in it pretty well. But the situation in these ethnic communities simply is different. We ask you to recognize that and to approve these resolutions for the well-being of the whole church, that we might become the beloved community. Finally, the committee is not happy with the idea, the Resolutions Committee is not happy with the idea of a 2% across the board budget contribution to the new fund. They say that this is an unusual budgeting practice. Yet in 2 Chronicles 31:5, we read, the people of Israel gave in abundance the first fruits of grain, wine, oil, honey, and of all the produce of the field. And they brought in abundantly the tithe of everything. I would say that it is a faithful thing, well in line with our biblical tradition, to offer a portion of all that is given to the church as an offering to try to heal the injustices between communities of color and white communities. We are not asking for a 10% tithe here, but we could if anyone wants to amend the resolution that way. I don't think that fear of setting a precedent should stop us from taking concrete steps with this resolution and the other resolutions presented by the Circles of Color and their allies to correct implicit and explicit injustices inherent in our existing structures and policies. Thank you.
So Joe, Peter asked, how was the 2% target kind of determined? Is there some background or data that make the 2% a specific amount?
The 2% would not be adequate to, at this point in time, to pay more than 1 or maybe 2 people. And so this is really a beginning, and it was, it's a start for this process, and it's that would be about $96,000 as the budget stands now.
Thank you. I think everything else has been answered in the chat.
Okay.
Thank you, Joe. You did great with time and we're doing really well. So I would like to invite moving to the next resolution.
Good evening to everybody. I'm Edie Weller. I'm a retired priest in the diocese. I am an associate at St. Mark's Cathedral, a member for a long time of the anti-racism training team here in the diocese, and a member of the Allies Circle, along with Joe and Nigel and a number of others. And my privilege this evening is to speak to you a little bit about Resolution 8, which calls for the addition of a cultural interpreter to the ordination process, specifically for BIPOC applicants. Along with Nigel and Polly, I wanted just to signal to you that this resolution, number 8, what we will be speaking to tonight and what we will raise tomorrow afternoon at convention is a substitute resolution based on the feedback that we got from the resolutions committee. And the wording for our somewhat revised resolution 8 can be found on pages 21 and 22 of the resolution report. It's not dramatically different, but what you'll see tonight on the following several slides is that revised language. So I'll briefly describe the resolution a little bit and then some more specifics. So this resolution presented to the convention this year is to direct the Commission on Ministry to offer each applicant, postulant, and candidate who self-identifies as a member of a BIPOC community the assistance of a cultural interpreter, with the call for this person to accompany those applicants through the entire duration of their process for holy orders. The interpreter's role is to interpret the cultural identity and assumptions of that person who is in the process and that of the Commission on Ministry. So it really is meant to be a two-way learning process for all the people involved in that interaction. We recommend that the interpreter be approved by the applicant, someone either known to them or recommended to them. That person, at the very core of this process, that person, the interpreter, needs to be aware in some depth of the candidate's culture of origin, as well as the rules and procedures of the Commission on Ministry, to be bilingual in that respect, and able to answer the applicant's questions about the culture of our diocese. And finally, the interpreter will be part of the process in the sense that that person would accompany the BIPOC person at the stage of application of postulancy and candidacy to all commission meetings as requested. That person would be bound by all rules of confidentiality of the commission and would be compensated as are other language interpreters who participate as needed with persons in this evaluation and discernment around holy orders. So this resolution really is part of the whole, as Nigel described, part of a more comprehensive effort to support the leadership development for persons self-identifying from BIPOC communities. As I'm sure everybody on this meeting knows, the ordination process is a multi-year process with very defined stages. And at the center of that process at our diocesan level is the Commission on Ministry, which is the body to help discern and assess individuals' call to ordained ministry. At this time, the majority of the members of the Commission on Ministry come from the white community. Over many generations, the majority of the people coming before the Commission on Ministry have come from the white community. And so what we are doing is trying to recognize the situation into which BIPOC applicants, candidates, postulants interact with that group at this crucial stage of the discernment for holy orders. At this time, we have a number of people in the process for holy orders who come from a variety of different communities, from the indigenous community, the Hispanic community, Cambodian, Sudanese, and African American. And as Jo described a few minutes ago in her presentation, folks hailing from other cultures come into this process with a different understanding of how they communicate, how they interact with others, how discernment is done, how decisions are made. They have different experiences of and perhaps visions for their ministry. And so a different frame of reference coming into their interactions with the Commission on Ministry. The cultural interpreter, this resolution proposing the addition of a cultural interpreter, recognizes that culture is often invisible or not obvious. It goes beyond language. The interpreter's role then, like a language interpreter, is to observe the interactions in the process between the applicant and the Commission on Ministry, to listen to the conversation, and to, in support of both of those groups, both the applicant and the Commission, to point out places where there may be a lack of understanding or a misunderstanding between those two, and to help give an explanation or to help frame ideas around that. We are aware that with the work that has been going on in the diocese over the last several years, that the Canon to the Ordinary, Ariane Davison, has had the opportunity to do work with the Commission, talking about cultural differences and broadening understanding. And the proposal that we're making here is to take that one step further and to offer a resource who has understanding of the specific cultures of those who are in process, who can be there on an ongoing basis as they interact with the Commission on Ministry, and to offer strategies, again, to deepen learning and help deepen conversation and understanding. And in this way, it really is a two-way learning process for both the individual and the Commission. It can help identify things in the applicant's understanding of their own ministry ongoing, the kinds of leadership that is needed in an ethnic congregation that may not be the same that is expected or desired in a white congregation. And so through those conversations over time, build up an awareness of the leadership gifts within BIPOC candidates, the needs of ethnic congregations, and really the broadening understanding of our collective concept of leadership and ministry in the Episcopal Church. So I just want to address a few of the things that were in the resolution committee's feedback to us, and these are some of the things that are in the revised language of the resolution. First, that the cultural interpreter, we changed the wording. It would not be this would not be a resource that would be required, but would be offered to BIPOC candidates. It would be someone of the BIPOC postulant's own choosing. That kind of comfort in relationship is important to be able to establish trust and effective two-way communication. This is a unique role that is not the same as a member of the Commission on Ministry acting as a liaison, or someone from the outside who might be a spiritual director already established. It should be someone who has significant cross-cultural experience and familiarity with both cultures, both that of the applicant postulant and that of the Commission on Ministry, the diocese, and the church. In some cases, the person who acts as a language interpreter, if needed, might fill that same role or that expanded role, but I would not necessarily make that as an assumption in every case. We see that the circles of color might be a resource, as might be the Refugee Resettlement Office. And perhaps most likely, it may be that the persons in the process may be able to make a recommendation themselves from the membership of their own communities or their extended networks in their local communities. So I hope that helps provide a little bit of clarification about how we envision the role of the interpreter. The basis for this is to deepen learning between the commission and the person in process for holy orders, to deepen our awareness of the gifts and the needs of leadership in the communities of color, and to provide a person who stands with both parties here, both the applicant and the commission, as a resource to both, not an advocate specifically for the postulant, but someone who can provide, kind of expand the envelope of learning and understanding and clarification where needed.
So Edie, if you can kind of guide us toward questions.
Yes, that's exactly where we are. So I just wanted to make those clarifications and open it to any questions you may have.
So Edie, I'm seeing a lot of support, and also using the resolution as kind of a launching pad for some other ideas, including some cultural competency training for COM members. There was also a thought about asking someone to be a cultural interpreter during maybe the first year after ordination. So there's a number of different, kind of good suggestions kind of flowing out of this. But I don't really see any deep questions besides some technical ones here. So I think we can move on.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Edie. That was really great. I love the whole overview. It was very thorough, and I appreciate all the dialogue and conversation it's generated. It's great. And as some people are saying, it is potentially, very innovative and can be a model for the rest of the church to show that kind of allyship and willingness. And now I'd like to move, I believe, to our final resolution, resolution number 9, adopting the Anti-Racism Covenant of the Diocese of Missouri. Carla.
Okay, I'm the Reverend Carla Robinson. I'm the Associate Priest at Christ Episcopal Church in the University District, and I've wandered around this diocese a little bit, and maybe a number of you have seen me show up in a pulpit near you. So the resolution that I want to present today, again, as you've already heard, these are a package. They come out of a set of common ideas and hopes. And I would consider this resolution to be both a container for what we have heard so far, and also as the place where you may hear bits and pieces of the resolutions that we've already done. So the resolution, and if we can go on to our next slide, the resolution is actually to call us as a convention to sign on to something that is already in existence. To actually go ahead and sign on to it personally, and more than that, to promote it for our education. And then finally, to also help this convention commend to all of its congregations the implications as well as the work that is called for. Like many of you, I saw that video of police officers, on the neck of George Floyd, and was horrified. I was also sad to say, there's a part of me that said, oh, here we go again. When will this end? Where's the voice of my church? So this covenant comes out of a reaction that happened in many places, but in particular in the Diocese of Missouri. They put pen to paper and tried to pull together some of the things that are happening not only in our church, but also in other church bodies. In particular, the idea was the partnership with our siblings in the Evangelical Lutheran Church America. And so again, this is a partnership that already exists in terms of its formality. And as it began to grow and move across the country, amazing numbers of folks signed on, institutions as well as individuals. So the thing that you will see in our resolution is the text of this covenant, but you won't see the amazing number of people who have signed on. So if I can go on to our next slide. The idea of the covenant, and again, I reinforce that it's not something we wrote, but it comes out of, I think, a very common experience of the church to root out racism. I think a number of us sort of said a few years ago when President Obama was elected, that's it, we're done with racism, we can finally move on. However, I think we have seen what I want to actually read as a quote. While positive changes have occurred at certain times in various situations, racism not only persists in our world, but in many places is powerfully resurgent. If you'd like to know who said that, that would be the Episcopal House of Bishops. You know, we have said that. So as you read through the covenant and see its general idea, it branches into two ideas, that we are looking at the things we lament and as well as the things we covenant to. A lot of that language comes out of statements that we have already said as a church, and comes out of an understanding of things that come out of our larger understanding of the history that we have with racism. The covenant itself, and I just want to point out a couple of brief things, actually calls us to remember that racism is sin. It is experienced daily. It is something that experiences all over, not only the world, but the church. Again, I would like to quote, sin of racism is experienced daily in our society, in our church, in its institutions, and in the House of Bishops. We have listened firsthand to accounts of our brothers and sisters bishops who have faced racial prejudice and discrimination and have struggled to maintain a sense of integrity and personal worth. The church in your community is filled with such stories. They are there to be heard and told. So again, this is not something that's coming from a limited perspective. This is something that the very heart of our leadership has looked at and is saying and speaking, and now wants to take yet another step. So the covenant is an attempt to take us further. As the covenant is divided into things we lament and things that we covenant to, please notice the broadness of it as well as the specificity of it. As you read through these laments and covenants, you're going to hear pieces of things that we've already said, as we've talked about institutional changes, as we've talked about specifically calling out where our church is, and specifically talking about the areas in which we can be engaged in very specific ways. Please also bear with me here as I share a couple of other quotes that are here in our thinking around why we're putting this covenant forth. We recognize that we are a part of the body that is itself infected with racism, which endangers our spiritual health. Those of us who are white acknowledge that our advantaged position inevitably reinforces the racism that we seek to dismantle. We believe that the time has come for us in the dominant culture to be still and listen to those on the margins of society, and so we commit ourselves. Again, who is saying such radical things? Our House of Bishops. The other thing that I would point out as I would ask you to consider this resolution is to notice that that the covenant itself does not have an end. It is admittedly open-ended, because part of what we are invited into in this covenant is to say, what else do God's people see as a place where we need to make change? I would conclude my brief explanation of this with my own personal commitment. The idea of this covenant is to speak not only to our specific congregations, but to our larger context. That can happen in the mouths of people who are doing presentations. I have always loved the opportunity to speak to congregations across our diocese. As someone who is a priest in this diocese and who enjoyed for quite some time the ability to appear in many pulpits, I myself could be helpful in what we covenant to and helpful in what we lament. You have seen before you as we have gone through our presentations, an entire amazing community of people who can likewise speak to these laments and help us in our covenant. I encourage you not only to consider this resolution and to pass it, not only to consider the covenant and to sign it, but to consider hearing from those of us who are specifically affected by the sin of racism that we seek to root out, that together we might all become and move toward being a beloved community. Thank you.
So Carla, I
would ask for any
don't see any
questions.
questions, but I have
Yes.
one. So, you know, I'm part of the Lutheran Church as well,
Please.
and I've seen a couple of statements. What's the difference between a covenant and a statement?
What we've decided, what we really are trying to make happen in the covenant, first off, to make ourselves larger, to actually step back and say, okay, yes, we are in a real partnership that we can do together. The other thing that I see that that this covenant is doing is it's coming from the other end. It started down and came up, rather than our statements which have a tendency to start up and go down. So that's one of the things that I love about it. And the other thing that I think makes it a little better to get with is that it does specifically call us to add stuff at the grassroots level so that we can continue to do this kind of work together. Hope that's helpful.
Sometimes, Terry, too, statements don't necessarily oblige us to anything. We can feel good that we
Right.
have made a statement, whereas a covenant, like our baptismal covenant, continues to pull us and push us and call us and nag us to change and to be part of something truly transformative. I'd like to, Katya, I believe, is that the conclusion of our slides?
Yes, it is. I can stop sharing now.
Thank you so much, Katya, for putting that slideshow together for us and for running it. Thank you. So I posed a question over to the chat, just asking if there's anyone in attendance who would want to revisit any of the resolutions or have any general comments or questions. And I encourage you again to maybe put those in the chat for us. Do folks feel like you can support these resolutions, or do you have any reservation? Sure, of course. Someone has asked, would you just give the numbers of the resolutions that have been substituted? The resolutions that will be substituted on the floor are included in the appendices of the Resolutions Committee report. The 3 resolutions that are substitute resolutions in the appendices are Resolution 5, 6, and 8.
So Rachel, there is a question from David here about, he's asking how this might apply. He's talking about the cultural partners, interpreters, how that might apply to the differences of another denominational transfer.
Okay, so may I ask for him to come on and maybe explain that just a little bit, if you would unmute and share with us a little bit.
Yeah, and I'm not particularly concerned. I mean, I wasn't trying to, I just want to raise the question about what do we mean by culture? Because there are many forms. There are some obvious ones that I think are intended and I fully support. But how do we put some boundaries about that? It is, as someone who transferred in from the ELCA, and I'm not the only one that's come from another denomination, those are also cultural transitions. Do we really intend to apply this to that kind of situation? And if not, how do we define the kind of cultural interpretation we're talking about to be sure that we hit the target and don't open a Pandora's box of other cultural interpretations that people start to ask for that were not part of the original intention or what we really are trying to address here?
Thank you very much. So the subtleties of the difference between different corporate cultures, subcultures of a dominant culture are certainly distinct from the cultures represented or identifying within ethnicity. And so very specifically, this package of resolutions delves again and again and again into communities of color and people of color. And the way that that's identified, ethnicity is self-described and not, applied from the outside. But if a day ever came where Lutherans who had joined the church in sufficient numbers felt like they needed some interpretation, maybe they would come forward and ask for that. It certainly doesn't prohibit the expansion of our understanding of diversity or the need for interpretation. But our focus of the whole package and of this particular one is to really focus on the ethnic identities that people of color name and claim as significant core identities that need cultivation and appreciation. I hope that perhaps answered the definition of a boundary for that.
But I think that, this is Joe here, the title of the resolution is Cultural Interpreter to BIPOC Ordination Process. So for the moment, if someone was transferring in and had to go through the mechanisms of the COM and was a person of color from a Lutheran background, then this would apply to them. But I think the title makes it explicit.
And David, I think the resolution is not necessarily sort of drilling down onto ethnicity itself, but trying to keep it more broad within the scope of people of color as they identify ethnicity for themselves.
Can I add something as a member of the COM that I need longer and more intentional help in realizing the long-term cultural prejudice I have towards people of color. Whereas in COM, I don't think I have deeply rooted prejudices against Lutherans. So I think that's kind of where the difference is in these resolutions. That doesn't mean that isn't a good idea, to have more perhaps than a mentor, in the diocese with someone who's coming from another denomination. But I think that the intentional wording on these resolutions goes deeper than cultural misunderstanding.
Thank you for that. And really the overall goal is to provide pathways for partnership between dominant culture and people of color that is genuine partnership, and really trying to move away from the power dynamics, so they're sort of top down, that come along with the dominant culture white church that sometimes struggles with how do you partner and genuinely enter into genuine relationship that is equality within that power dynamic. So we're really trying to encourage ways to reevaluate how those power dynamics can be very repressive and oppressive to the ability that we all seek, I think, in genuine relationship and understanding.
So Rachel, another question just came in. This is about kind of process. Have the BIPOC members of our community who are discerning the priesthood being consulted about what they would like in an interpreter?
Thank you. I can answer for two of the people who are Indigenous candidates, and both of them have experienced just the general frustration of what they experience as an expectation that they are supposed to know everything that the dominant culture folks in front of them are asking of them, and agree with all those things without any understanding or accommodation for the reality of their lives and the reality of how they're interpreting their spiritual journey through the lens of culture and identity and history. For example, one indigenous person who's in the process, they're going through the process of Iona School. And I've spoken with the director of Iona School. And he is very clear that it was never conceived as a process for people of color or people who are informed by a different culture primarily. So it comes out of the same place as a dominant culture seminarian substitute for going to a dominant culture seminary. So, we need to continue to press how we evaluate our people of color who are so deeply informed by the richness of their own culture, and not simply allow kind of a steamrolling effect of putting the burden on them to measure up to an unarticulated yardstick of dominant culture and here's one of the ways I frame this sometimes. We often hear our COMs talking about the need for candidates to understand that they're being ordained for the whole church. And what they mean by that is that they need to sort of measure up to the ability to talk within a predominantly white church and operate within it. But we're not, by using the same standard to tell our white people going through the process that they need to be deeply familiar with Hispanic, Latino cultures within their diversities, and indigenous cultures within their diversities, and African American cultures within their diversities. So it is an unequal playing field with an unequal set of expectations.
So the next question has to do with how to ensure financial resources to support these resolutions, and I'm sure that's a conversation that will come up this weekend. So I see that Nigel has responded to that, but are there any other ways people would like to respond to that question about financial resources?
Joe, I wonder if you wanted to share anything about what you may be aware of in terms of financial resources specifically set aside or intended for some of the ministries of color.
In this, as I said, it's generally been a question of going to the bishop and begging for money, and there seems to be money there, as Nigel's comments implied. However, there have been two specific funds in this diocese intended for people of color. One is the Richard Young fund for curates of color. I don't know, and I don't know of anybody else who knows what happened to that fund. I bet a lot of people on this call remember going to see Black Nativity. And the diocese bought out all the tickets for that. And it was an amazing Christmas celebration. And we raised a lot of money, and that went into the Richard Young Fund for curates of color for the first year after they're ordained. But that was organized and fundraised by the committees that Rachel has mentioned, the African American Committee specifically. I think, I'm kind of just guessing, that got rolled over into a fund or the money that gets used for curates in general. And we haven't had a curate of color. We had one, I believe, who maybe benefited from that fund, but nobody really knows. So there hasn't been any transparency or accountability about those funds. There's another fund that was set up over 10 years ago, and it was named for Bishop Rivera in honor of her. And it has a substantive amount of money in it. It was supposed to be set up by the bishop. There was supposed to be an advisory committee, and that was to assist the functioning of existing Hispanic Latino congregations. And that could have gone for salaries, it could have gone for operating expenses of those congregations. In the time, I can think of at least 3 Hispanic congregations that would have qualified for money from that fund. However, the bishop apparently just forgot that that fund existed. And so I know of at least 3 congregations, like I say, that would have qualified for that money, that went through varying kinds of crises, and that fund was never used. So all it really did was to contribute to the bottom line of the Diocese of Olympia. It did not contribute to the growth and or maintenance of the Hispanic congregations that it was intended for, and that really should have been entitled to. So we're hoping that this fund, which would be different. So there's a curacy fund, there's a operating expenses, including clergy fund, and this would be a third fund. That is the operating expenses fund is specifically for Hispanic congregations, and this fund is for ethnic congregations, whatever, and specifically for clergy, for paying clergy salaries. So the point is that would make 3 funds, and there needs to be accountability, there needs to be transparency, because there's been money floating around there that hasn't been used at a time when congregations of color have been in various and sundry kinds of crisis, such that they have gone, as Rachel said at the beginning, from being vibrant, exciting, growing parts of this diocese into being kind of withered pieces of what they used to be. So that's what I have to say about the history, and we hope we can, it's been called to the bishop's attention that he needs to get that Bishop Rivera Fund up and functioning. Hopefully we'll find out whatever happened to the Curates of Color Fund, and we'll be able to set this up.
Thank you, Joe. There's also something I would add is there's another piece of money that was associated with Indigenous Ministries that came from a UTO grant. And we barely spent about half of that, and probably had between $8,000 and $12,000 that we don't know where it is. And we think it went into an investment fund, but we don't know, and we've not really had a report about that. I think Jim Campbell and others have sort of drilled down into that more thoroughly. So, but the thing that's frustrating about that is for the past 17 years, the Nisqually Reservation has been proactively seeking partnership with the Episcopal Diocese to establish a mission among the Nisqually. And while we had Nettie Rivera, we visited there to begin to establish what that might look like. And we have an Indigenous person in the process who would become that missioner if and when he ever gets ordained. And so we have things in place, but it needs a little bit of financial commitment. And he would also fall within the category that Joe has talked about that 2% sweeping across the board to be able to help even sustain him in doing that mission at all. So there's a lot of pieces that need to come together. And the reality is, in our feeling collectively, that there has not really been a strategic plan for developing ethnic ministries, ethnic communities, missions, etc. It's almost like they're considered lost leaders in a corporate model of nonprofit business. And so we ask the question, what are we really committed to? We are called to be a kingdom people. And that is not about holding on to money and investing it so we have it forever. The investment needs to be in people. I'm again very, very grateful for all of you to be with us today. It's been a very powerful and meaningful process and opportunity for all of us, and we hope it has been for you. And we continue to look forward to walking into convention with you in partnership, and continue to pray for all of us, please, as we enter into the deliberations on Friday afternoon. And also, again, as the Circles of Color panel will share stories of perseverance and pain on Saturday morning, because that too is important steps towards the relationship with a beloved community that we truly, truly seek. I asked Terry
If I could, before you do that, if I could just
Please.
add one thing. We believe we've done a good job here in engaging with the Resolutions Committee and Constitution and Canons. We've tried to be responsive in those places where they came up with good suggestions. We know that these are not perfect. Jesus is not coming tomorrow. The danger is always that nothing is done because someone has a concern. So I would encourage you to look at these and to pass them. And then we can, if it turns out that it doesn't, there's something that needs to be fixed, we'll come back and fix it. Let's not do nothing.
Thank you. And again, as Joe has beseeched, please share what you've shared with your delegation and congregation. And we deeply look forward to entering into genuine and deep and profound conversation throughout convention. And I would like to invite Terry, would he please close us with prayer?
The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. Almighty God, who created us in your image, grant us grace fearlessly to contend against evil and to make no peace with oppression, and that we may reverently use our freedom. Help us to employ it in the maintenance of justice in our communities, among the nations, in our church. To the glory of your holy name, through Jesus Christ our Lord, who lives and reigns with you and the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever. Amen.
Amen.
Blessings to you all and good night. And we will journey with you in the days ahead.